I'm Liz Nelson. I run something called Project C. I work with and elevate the work of people who are working in creator model journalism, or AKA news influencers, and I'm really excited to be here to talk to you all about this today. It's so important. If you attended the morning sessions with Maribel and then with the panel that Jim Brady led, there were some recurring themes. And what I heard, and the themes that I really zoned in on, was the need to think about big, bold ideas and to be faster as an industry at adapting to and supporting change in the journalism space. And one quote that stuck with me in particular, which I think, and I might be misattributing this, but from Dean Becca, he said, quote, younger generations of journalists understand the audience more, end quote. And that is actually why a growing number of young journalists, and Paul Krugman apparently, are leaving institutional journalism to build their own direct-to-audience platforms. And more young journalists are actually never setting foot in traditional newsrooms. They are starting out directly by building their audience connection on social platforms and with newsletters. And I'm really excited because we're starting to talk about this in spaces. I led a workshop at ONA earlier this journalism season, so last fall, and we're talking about it here. But we need to understand this space more, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today because there's a lot of fuzziness around, as Kat mentioned, the word news influencer. Like, what does that mean? What is a news influencer? Are they journalists? Not all of them, as we heard. I work with, at Project C, the 23% that Kat pointed out that do come from a journalism background or use journalistic principles in their work. And we need to support this. We need to embrace it. The question for all of us, and something that we're about to jump into, is whether you're a newsroom, a funder, a journalist, an academic program, is how do we engage with, learn from, and support the best practices in this space. So with that, we're gonna talk to these fine folks up here on the stage and learn a little bit more. And I actually want to start with Becca Farsace. You left The Verge to launch your own YouTube channel where you talk about tech and tech reviews and devices. And what is your job title? What do you call yourself?
We're just going to keep passing mics down. So I call myself a content creator. For 7 years, I was at The Verge and trained as a video journalist. But now I've taken on content creator because I believe it describes what I do as a whole best. There are parts of my day where I am an influencer. I have to sell my audience something, much like other media companies have to. And at that point in time, I'm an influencer. That's part of my business. And then there's other parts of my day where I am calling sources. I am writing pieces. I am researching. And at that moment in time, I'm a journalist. But at large, my product is content that is seen predominantly on YouTube. So I've just taken content creator, and I feel that describes me best. And is also the most digestible. Most folks don't have much of a feeling about a content creator, whereas in journalist or influencer, they definitely do.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, and we were talking before this, and you said, I'm Becca. And I thought that was like a really great way to answer it. I want to turn to you, Joy. Project C and Trusting News have been working a lot lately to think about trust when it comes to the creator journalism and news influencer space and understanding how creator model journalists signal that trust. What do you see in the creator space that's different from the news organizations that Trusting News has been working with, and what has surprised you?
Well, one thing that's interesting is that journalists often work for institutions and operate as part of an institution. And that feels correct to us, and it also feels trustworthy to us. The sort of checks and balances that come with an institution. We have an editor, as we were talking about. We have policies we follow, that sort of thing. That is a signal to some people that something is more worthy of trust. To other people, being part of an institution is actually less worthy of trust. That having some independence, being able to inject your own experience and perspective into the message. Some people find that delivery, sort of turning to a trusted friend, especially in video format, but not just in video. Newsletters often have the same kind of tone. That can be something that engenders a lot more trust. For us at Trusting News, my team and I all came out of newsrooms, and we're used to working with newsrooms, but our North Star is not helping newsrooms evolve, it's helping people wherever they turn for information see their own values, perspectives, priorities, information needs reflected back to them. And so wherever people are turning for information, I want them to find signals of credibility. And it turns out it doesn't much matter because it's not up to journalists whether something is credible, as it turns out. The public is figuring out for themselves what is relatable and credible and accessible and entertaining. And we're here to try to help the industry figure out how to respond to that, and also to help the creators who do align with the principles of journalism to figure out how they can stand out from the noise and what it looks like. We're very curious about what signals, what messages and signals of transparency and credibility work in creator spaces. Like, we work with journalists on things like drawing attention to your ethics and making sure people know that if you mess up, you'll correct an error, and like which of those things translate well into a creator space and which don't. Liz and I are looking for funding partners to do some like research and put together some cohorts to work on that kind of thing, because we have a lot of questions and also a lot of just excitement, I think, about this new space.
Yeah, absolutely. And while you were talking, it made me think, we have seen a lot of focus on kind of news influencers and creators, especially through this last election cycle. There was a lot of press around creators and influencers being invited to the conventions and now the White House. And that's like brought up a lot of chatter within our industry about like, what does that mean? Are we being pushed out of the way? And I was wondering, Joy, does it remind you of any other moment in our past?
Gosh. Well, some of us have been around a while.
Yeah.
And it reminds me a lot. Okay, so the moment I go back to is like 2009. When I was teaching at the Missouri School of Journalism, we were working with like creators around the community. Like, we had a little citizen journalism site. And do you know what we called them? Bloggers. And do you know how the industry responded to bloggers? Oh no, it can't be credible. They're not journalists, they're a blogger. Turns out, you know what I found myself saying to my colleagues at the Missouri School of Journalism? Turns out a blog is not a type of content. It's a medium of publication where the newest post goes at the top, right? It's the same conversation I feel like we're having now. And I worry that we'll repeat some similar mistakes in terms of like forming an exclusive club and deciding who doesn't belong, instead of realizing that it's not up to us. And you know what I remember figuring out at that moment? Some of the people we were approaching and saying, oh, we'd love to republish your blog on our like journalism site, some of them didn't care, even back then. Yeah. They were like, what do I get out of that? Why does that matter?
Yeah, as somebody who was a blogger at 2005 in the Washington Post, like I lived this and feel it.
I'm sorry for...
Maybe that's why I work with creator journalists now. I don't know. So I want to shift again and talk a little bit more about trust. And I know Kat from Pew and from Reuters Institute and some other places, there have been a lot of studies, not just in the last year, but in the last year, showing a steep drop-off in trust in institutions and institutional media, institutional journalism. Can you tell us a little bit more about what your team is seeing in this space in general, but also as it applies to younger and younger audiences?
Yeah. Trust is very complex. I'm sure I'm not saying anything earth-shattering here, but it's complex, and you're right, there has been a big hit on institutional trust. Is that new? No, the trend has been there for a while. On the idea of institutional media and the trust and the confidence we have in those entities to do what is good for people, or basically providing the information that people need. That is not also unique to just the media. There is a wider institutional distrust that we can see it in government, we've seen it now in academia, in science, we have evidence and data, especially at the center, at Pew, where we see this type of trend. Now, does this mean that all trust is gone, right? No one trusts anything, there is nothing out there. No, there is trust, and we see that where there is specific groups or based on your political ideology, many times. You have trust in specific brands, in specific people, in specific ways, or you even trust some content from some places and other content from other places. It's very, very complex. So I do want to emphasize that because I know the broad strokes of institutional trust is what kind of like paints everything, and then we have this kind of feeling of, oh my God, it's so terrible, right? And nothing is gonna be fixed. Well, no, there is that. And one of the things that we are seeing in this work with content creators and news influencers is the fact that there is, if not trust, and we don't want to say it in those terms, there is personal connection, there is uniqueness, as I showed, like people feel that they're getting news and information that they cannot get elsewhere, that the person is actually talking to them and they're listening, and those are specific traits that we have seen in our research actually increases trust. Like they're very much related and associated. So if anyone is asking me, what do I do to increase trust, right? Our data show that personal connection and having spoken even to a journalist, we've asked this in local news, actually increases positive assessments of the media and of the people that you're getting your news from.
Yeah.
So he's laughing.
No, yeah.
I'm laughing because we have a trust kit on our website about how to respond to comments. I can't get newsrooms to respond to comments. And yet we know, I mean, a lot of what is baked into what is working so well about what creators do is that the engagement and responsiveness that's like baked in, it's not an extra.
Well, okay, so this is not where I was going to go, but I am going to go there. So we were talking a little bit before the panel, Becca, about your relationship with your audience and, the jumping into comments. Like, talk to us about what that relationship looks like, how that has built kind of like, or if it has built the trust that your audience has in you, and how that's different from what your relationship was with the audience when you were with The Verge.
Yeah. Well, at The Verge, we would respond to comments as well, predominantly on YouTube. And when you did, you were using The Verge's YouTube channel. And so I would sign Becca, but they would see The Verge. And who is The Verge, right? That's not a real person. I don't know how they feel about things. And now when I respond, it's my face. I don't have to sign my name. And I feel more connected with them. And I think that they do too, my audience. That is, I've also gotten to know my audience, like actual people in my audience, not just in a general sense, oh, they're mostly male, 35 years old, not that. I know Phil, I know Tina. Like these are folks that come to every video, they comment on every video, and I try to respond to, and we're building something together. And I'm starting to know them deeper, which is helping my business, because I know what maybe I should advertise on my channel, what they might like, what they might buy, and that's the part of my business I don't love. But I'm also noticing what content they want to see. What should I be putting my time in? Who should I be learning more about? What should I be digging deeper into? And that's because, Phil said something, and I know he'll like this, and I'm doing it for him. And it goes both ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that you even mentioned that now some of the folks that you've built relationships with in the comments have become sources and led to stories.
Yes. I'm doing a piece this spring where I'm going to bike from New York City to Rochester, New York on an e-bike powered by solar panels. So it's completely off the grid. Wish me luck. I have never biked 400 miles in my life. We'll see what happens. That's just part of, being a YouTuber is you just do crazy things. But somebody who is in my Patreon has built a solar-powered e-bike before. And he reached out to me and he's like, hey, I've done this. Do you want to come out to Washington and I will build your solar panel trailer? And I was like, yeah, I know nothing about solar. There's a solar source. He can teach me about this. I'm going to film it. He can teach my audience about this. And then I'm going to come home with the trailer that, if the sun shines, will power my ride. A lot of ifs here you're seeing. But even right now, we're having a connection, right? You're on a journey with me. When I was at The Verge, it was a lot harder for folks to be on my journey. They were on The Verge's journey. And now it's me and my audience. And we're going to ride from New York City, hopefully, to Rochester.
That's fascinating. I would love to go on that trip with you as long as like the power actually works. So don't know that I want to.
I can't promise that.
As long as it's Sunday.
I'm going to stay with you one more second. So you were talking a little bit ago in one of your answers about like sometimes you are going out and seeking sponsorships, other times you are in the comments, like other times you're reporting. And I think one of the common critiques that has been levied at creator model journalism is that there's no oversight in many ways. You don't have an editor in many cases that you're working with, or in your case, an EP. You are actually doing the sales like piece of it. So like it's a little bit different. And those are things that like as an industry, we all care about deeply. It's how we were brought up and raised in this industry is to understand those things. But how is that impacting, like how do you signal credibility to your audience? Do they care about those things?
Yeah, there are definitely days where I miss having an editor, 100%. I make mistakes now that are published and they're out there, and it hurts me, which usually makes me step up more the next time, but also allows me to say, hey audience, I messed up. And then there's another moment of trust. When I was at The Verge, of course, we'd catch mistakes much earlier on, or if they did get published, they'd get corrected, but it was such a formal correction. Who made that correction? And did they actually realize their mistake? Now, when I make mistakes, it's all on me, but it's a moment to build more trust and to learn, for everybody to learn, about me and my content, but also for me to do better next time. So yeah, I miss some structure once in a while. I miss health insurance mostly, 401k match also. But I don't think making a mistake is something to be afraid of. I think it's a moment for everyone to grow.
Yeah, most definitely. Joy, I think that directly speaks to the work that you do, and you've helped organizations craft corrections policies. How are you thinking about this, like from like broad advice in the creator space? Like, what are you seeing?
Well, I'm coming at it with a lot of humility and curiosity. I get really excited when I see transparency, when I see that a Substack has a really good FAQ about what their approach, what they're there to do. Anything related to sort of ethics and credibility, I get very excited about that. But that's also words, which is my primary medium. And so I have a ton of curiosity, especially when it comes to video and just other platforms. So there's just a lot that I think we need to know about when things that work in traditional media will add to credibility and when it could actually be a net negative if we do it improperly.
All right, so we're going to shift gears in a second to go into Q&A, but before we do that, I wanted to do a little bit of a round robin and ask each of you who is a creator model journalist that this room should make sure to check out when they leave here today, in addition to Becca and her work on YouTube. So, Kat, I'm actually going to start with you.
I'm going to be the unconventional because I'm not going to go with an American or a US influencer because my needs, I'm from Greece, some of you know that, so that's where I lack information. So it is a digital-only influencer, is Elena Papadimou. She is for FYI News in Greece, and I follow her, and that's how I get my news from my motherland.
Thanks. All right, Joy.
I want to remind you, if you were here last year, that there was a panel on this topic, and a journalist on that panel named Jessica Yellen runs a really fantastic Substack and social channels called News Not Noise. And I've been following Jessica much more closely since last year. And if you're nervous about this space, she might be an effective transition for you because her history is in broadcast. She worked for like national TV news covering politics. So I think her style feels familiar, but the way she is looking for sources with her audience, the way she is she's like got the trusted friend thing down. Like she also reminds people to step away. She's like, I'm going to try to help you have a healthier news diet, and I want to be someone you can turn to and trust to only give you what you need and to help you make sense of things.
All right, Becca.
I don't have an exact person, but when you log on to YouTube I want you to watch the video with the least amount of views, because you will both see what works and what doesn't work. So that's my advice.
Okay, all right, interesting advice. I will look for the least amount of views. So for me, I'm going to actually share a journalist named Marissa Cabas, who writes a newsletter called The Handbasket, and she actually broke the federal funding freeze story a few weeks ago, first on Blue Sky, plug for the Blue Sky panel later, and then wrote about it on her newsletter. And I talked to Marissa a lot because she's an investigative journalist who is working by herself out of her apartment in Brooklyn. And for me, it's a great chance to learn like what the challenges are that she deals with on a daily basis. Like, first of all, she is flooded now with tips that are coming in from sources within the federal government about what's happening in DC, and so she's sifting through all of that. But she's also somebody who is working by herself, creating work that normally a journalist working within a news organization would have a lot of protections for. Liability insurance, First Amendment lawyers, protection if you get doxxed. And she's navigating all of that on her own. And so with Project C, that's part of the work that I'm trying to do, is like help build best practices in this space to understand, so that others who come behind Marissa don't have to learn these lessons and figure out where to get the support that they need. And some of that support in the future may be by partnering with news organizations, both at the national and the local level. They are actually very open to that. It's just having an understanding of how to do that in the right way so that it's mutually beneficial. All right, so with that, I'm gonna go and open up the mics for Q&A. There are mics, I think, at both sides of the room, and I think we're more interested in answering and hearing your questions than what we had prepared, so. Oh, hi.
Hi, I'll just talk in this mic. I attended the session this morning about reporter safety, and I was wondering if you've worked in a newsroom before and then switching over to being more independent, or looking at both of these fields and maybe working in both, what difference do you see and what support do journalists need working independently or being content creators when it comes to safety? And then also, I'm just curious about the financial security aspect of it being independent and how those that are working independently can be supported.
Becca, do you want to have any thoughts on the safety, and then I can chime in on the rest?
Yeah. I do like consumer technology. So the safety is like, don't fall off the bike, right? Like wear a helmet. So I feel relatively safe. Where I don't feel as safe is I don't work from an office anymore. I work from my home. All products that I get reviewed that come to me are shipped to a PO box that is not far from my home. That is what I worry about, is folks finding out where I live. And I don't have a great fix for that, other than not to show it in videos, do my due diligence, have a PO box and such. But that's one thing that's top of mind. I think more so, though, is the financial anxiety. I have never looked at my bank account more. I have never thought more about when the next paycheck is coming in, how will I make rent, and so on and so forth. Again, I don't have a great fix. My mom is a financial planner, so I call her. I'm like, yo, Mom, does this look okay? But those are scary things. It's just risk that I have to take. But as I was saying to this panel earlier, being independent has been such a reward mentally. I feel so free in what I can cover, who I can talk to, where I can go, not having to answer Slacks. Freedom.
All right, so when I sent you that Slack invite, now I'm like rethinking that. That's great.
It did. Tying back onto Slack. Really, I did it for you.
I didn't mean to trigger you. I'm sorry. Those are great questions, and I think Becca, the number one thing that I hear about safety from creator journalists is like people finding out where you live, and there are so many ways that people can find that out. Caitlin Dewey, who writes links I would G-chat you if we were friends, former Post writer, had a situation where she was being stalked by somebody who found out where she lives because the payment system, which I think was Stripe. You have to give Stripe an address for payments, and so that was public facing, and they were able to find her that way, even though she tried to protect herself in so many other ways from getting found out. So like you, now Caitlin has a P.O. box and is able to kind of make sure that there's a little bit of a firewall between them. But, in terms of like the business model, I mean, there are so many different ways, and certainly the way that Becca is monetizing is going to be, for a videographer who's working on YouTube, is very different from somebody who's working in newsletters. And, one of the things that I'm excited about in the newsletter space is how much proof positive we're seeing that people are willing to pay to support this work. We have people, who are making, I talked to former Washington Post and CNN journalist Chris Cillizza last week about his Substack, and he's got 24,000 subscribers. Not all are paying. 4,000 of them are paying, and with that 4,000, he's making around $250,000 a year. Now, again, working as a solo entrepreneur, you are also now then on the hook for the taxes and for paying for your health care, so there are those trade-offs, as Becca mentioned.
And just a note for like making money, if folks are interested in hearing about that. I have been amazed at how much people are willing to give to independent creators, to folks that they feel like they know. Like my Patreon, it starts at $2.50. And then there's a $5 option. And I've had folks reach out to me and say, hey, I would love to give you more every month. How can I give you more? So just don't be afraid to ask. And that's hard for me, but that's something I've learned.
My question has to do more with a lot of the journalists on my staff are content generators who have opinions. So with that, the question is, what best practices or action steps would you suggest that we take in converting them from just having an opinion to being an influencer?
Joy, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I mean, I guess our approach at Trusting News is very much that there's not one right answer to that, and it depends on your business model. So if they are joining a team where they need to be careful about removing their own lens on the world and their own perspective from their work, I think it's perfectly appropriate to try to help them figure out how to do that. I guess one of the things I like about the creator space is that we're seeing how people respond when you are helping them make sense of something in a way that also, you don't have to be so careful about sort of betraying how you're looking at it. And there's, sort of more like an analyst on TV where it's like I kind of get a sense of how somebody sees it. But I think I guess if your question is about like a more traditional newsroom team, I think we are seeing what happens where people who get a lot of information from personalities or creators and are used to their perspectives showing up in their content are then trying to figure out that like they might be even newer to the idea that you should remove it. And I guess I think that what happens, one of the things I've worked with editors on is helping young journalists take stock of that, because of what they want to do, if it feels really important to them to share information through their own lens and perspective, there are ways to do that. It might be that working with you is not a way for them to do that. And so I think just guiding them through that decision-making tree so that they understand, so that they say like your value proposition and why you are trusted might be core to keeping their own lived experiences separate from their products. So I guess it's just, I would like to have nuanced conversations about that. And I think with young journalists, just helping them understand that that's what is involved in working with you versus another way that they might go on and practice something that also looks a lot like journalism.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I do get a lot of questions from folks working within newsrooms, editors saying like, what can I do to adapt like lessons from creator journalism to like elevate our in-house talent, right? Like what can I do to like turn my star columnist into somebody who like kind of looks and feels like a creator model journalist and is able to attract audience in the same way. And there is a way to do that, but I would caution or ask that, as newsroom leaders, that you also think, like, what are you willing to do to compensate them for bringing that attention to your newsroom and to your organization? And, quite frankly, I think that that's been an issue that I've seen with a lot of people who have left traditional media, is that if they are bringing an outsized amount of eyeballs to a brand, they are not being compensated in a way that is actually recognizing the benefit that they're bringing. And it's just the world that we live in now, and that they want to be compensated, right? And should be. So I think that's something that news organizations need to reckon with, that if you want to keep the young talent that can go out and create these relationships with the audience on their own, you need to think about what are you doing to match what they're able to achieve if they're working by launching a YouTube channel or their own Substack. All right, let's go over to this mic.
Hey everybody, I'm Deepti from New Public. We're building kind of an alternative, publicly spirited alternative for Nextdoor. And some of the Pew research that came out last year has indicated that online forums and groups are where people are getting their news more than local news now. And so it's on that trend that we're really trying to build an alternative that can work. And I guess I'm just curious to hear from all of you on that role that you feel that those admins play. Because in some ways, I do think that we call them community stewards, because they are building trust within their communities as kind of the online admins or moderators, whether it be a Facebook group, a Reddit subthread. Nextdoor, unfortunately, doesn't have infrastructure for community leadership, but I am really curious because they are even more organic and less known than a formal influencer in a town, for example.
Yeah, I can start, and please contribute. You're right. So we have done work. Local news is the one that you are referring to, where we were asking about sources of local news, and one of the things that we saw kind of really being upward, especially because we had asked about it in 2018, is this rise of social media groups, forums, listservs, all of that, right? And that's an important part of the community. Now, let me add a couple more points there. One is that we actually have done deep dives on specific topics of local news, like crime and local crime, and political news, local political news. And one of the things that we're seeing is that this kind of disconnect, right? That people think it's important, it's very, they need this news for their lives and their functioning and all that, but they are having a very hard time finding it, right? So there is this gap, right? And we are seeing this upward trend of people moving and using these other spaces. Now, the challenge, and I'm gonna put a bit of my research nerdy hat here, is that these are very difficult spaces to study. They're closed off, you don't have access, and the reason why we know is because we ask the public, and the public responds, and they're like, yes, this is where I go, this is how I found out about, what is happening in my community. But actually understanding what is being shared there, how people talk about it, that's kind of it's a curtain or a door that not a lot of us have figured out how to get in there, because there's so much proprietary, right, and closed off. So that's kind of putting it out there, maybe in the universe. We would love to have data on that front. But yeah, you're right. It's a very important space now.
Yeah, and if you haven't checked it out, you should check out the research that Samantha Ragland and the American Press Institute are doing. They've been doing a lot of work about identifying local influencers in your community. And what is really interesting is that you really, at the local level, influencer has a very different meaning, right, than thinking about kind of who is the biggest TikTok viral hit. It is church leaders, it is, PTAs, it is the person who is the one source you want to talk to at the farm market every week. And so they're doing great work about how to both identify those people, but also how to reach out and build networks with them and work with them. I think we probably have time for one or two more questions. So.
Great. The first face that popped up was Taylor Lawrence's in your video. I'm a friend and a fan of hers, and her first post after the election was why the left can't build its own Joe Rogan kind of I forget what the exact title was. And I think about how I'm the executive director of the Society of Environmental Journalists, and there is just so much, obviously, climate disinformation, climate change denialism. And I'm curious, while obviously we're talking about journalism, so that political orientation isn't as much of that. If we're talking about whether it's tapping into influencers or picking up as journalistic organizations, kind of tapping into those narrative threads and what resonates, when it is so outsized, the billions of dollars going into podcasters, influencer networks from one political orientation, how does that shape some of this? Because there's that influence of the money part, but then the part of what's the counter narrative? And obviously climate change is where I'm coming from.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I would say that that's not unique to the creator influencer space. I mean, we've lived in a world now where for at least 10, if not 20 years, we've seen kind of like a similar outsized impact of like specific cable networks, right? Who are getting a lot of money and also like understand that they can tap into a certain rage or a way of like getting people to be very reactive or react to something that feels salacious. So it's a dynamic that is like a very old playbook, right? And so that is happening. I think that we are seeing a lot of organizing. I think it's really difficult because it isn't one factor, right? It's not just money that's going to one place. You also have to take into account that a lot of the spaces where you're seeing your Joe Rogans and others pop up are on platforms that also have a vested interest in maximizing the eyeballs that are spending their time on those platforms. And then, now, I mean, I don't think that I'm saying anything too incredibly out of order to say, like, we've seen one of, like, the formerly biggest social platforms, formerly Twitter, now X, become basically, one side of the equation's place to go for news. So there are a lot of things that we need to tease apart. I think that there are a lot of folks who are working on the other side of the equation that are building real audience. We're just not hearing about them in the same way.
Can I add one thing to that? I think when we look at the lines, the graphs, the data around trust in news, and we see that it was really dropping in the 80s. I always think about Rush Limbaugh, and I think about who managed to connect with audiences in different ways, separate from institutions. And so we started off this conversation talking about some people see connection to institutions as a net positive, and some see it as a net negative. And I think if there are people figuring out what it looks like to meet audience needs in a way that it feels freer and feels less structured and feels like there are fewer rules around it. And if people are responding to that, I think that's something we all should be paying attention to, rather than just saying, no, that's not real, that's not good. Figure out what we can learn from it.
Yeah, and just to add a bit, and maybe I'm pushing a bit on this issue here, polarization is real. And it's from both sides when it comes to news consumption. And we've seen it in our data, and it's not one measure, right? It's not just where you go for news, it's the attitudes that you hold, not just trust about the roles that news organizations should be playing, whether they're biased, all of that. It's the content that you're exposed. It's all very much through these partisan lens. So what I'm trying to say about the Joe Rogans and any other type of source, right, that is out there, it is the news information ecosystem, it's driven by this partisanship. That is what we're facing, right? I don't know how it's going to be tomorrow. I don't know how it's going to be in 10 years. Maybe, I don't know, the environment will shift. Nobody knows, right? But the truth is that now what we are seeing in the past even 15 years, and at least my team and I, that we've been looking at this for, at least 15, 20 years, there is this type of divergence, and it's getting more and more, right? The other element there, it is the fragmentation of the sources, right? But at the same time, when you're having fragmentation and so much, it's a high choice environment, you also have concentration. And what does concentration mean is that people are gathering around outlets or people, personalities, that they agree with or that they share values, partisan identity, whatever label want to put it there. So even though there's so much out there, there is kind of like flocking, and that kind of flocking is happening more on the right of the political spectrum. That's where we're seeing actually fewer outlets in a way and more concentration, whereas on the other side, the public is a bit more dispersed in how they're going around. And that's why it's very evident and so much discussed in a way.
All right, I think that is all we have time for today. But thank you so much to everybody for spending some time this afternoon with us. And thank you to all of the panelists. Appreciate you. All right.
Thank you.